All right, thank you for joining us here this afternoon for our webinar. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Emily Stringer. I work with our Consultant Services Department as a Consultant Services Advisor. Been with MBO Partners for about 5 years, helping our consultants engage with their clients smoothly. Here at MBO Partners, our goal is to make it easy for self-employed professionals and their clients to work together. We're currently the #1 back office solution for independent consultants. A couple of housekeeping points here about our webinar controls. You have a full screen icon to maximize your presentation area. And there's also a chat box where you can submit a question to the presenter. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so please be sure to submit your questions as we go along here today. You can also tweet at us during the webinar using #MBOWeb. A few points about your presenter today, Chris Simmons. He's the founder of Rainmakerz Consulting based out of Washington, D.C. He's served over 160 customers over 13 years as an independent consultant. He was nominated for Consulting Magazine's Top 25 Consultants. And with that, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Emily. If you're like most independent consultants, there's really nothing more important than making your current and future customers happy. Because doesn't it make sense that making your customers or prospects happy is the best way to grow your business? With so many companies and individuals competing for the same business, what can you do to help your customers understand and appreciate your unique value proposition? How does your value translate into the benefits your customers seek? How can you keep a customer happy for weeks, for months, or years to come, if that's your goal? In the next 40 minutes or so, I'll share some secrets to maintaining customer expectations and building trust to help you stand out from the crowd and truly provide your customers with a dramatic difference. I'll explore some of the challenges and opportunities that consultants have to achieving customer happiness and success, and answer some of the most difficult questions about why customers are happy with their services and why they're not. Some consultants focus on maximizing revenue, while other consultants focus on developing relationships. Both of these are often necessary for business success. But what is the appropriate balance of these seemingly opposing views? That sets us up for the challenge. Let's briefly talk about this challenge and some of the other challenges before we discuss what you can do to make your customers and keep your customers happy. Some people say it's easy for a consultant to make their customers happy. I mean, you're the expert. You're the hired gun. Customers listen to what you have to say. However, consulting is one of the earliest professions that exists, and there's a lot of people, a lot of potential customers and a lot of existing customers who have predisposed views of what consultants are and what they can't and what they're not. And they're not all positive views. Making and keeping customers happy depends on what your customer thinks about the profession, about your role, and about your ability to deliver. So making customers happy largely depends on why they hired you in the first place. Consultants play different roles. Some have high-profile roles, some are hardly noticed, some have various degrees of success, some have different reputations in their markets. But most of them are fit into either one or another category. Are you viewed as a helper in the organization that you're consulting, or a detractor? Are you viewed as a professional and paid to be one? Or are you viewed as a rookie consultant and paid to be one? Are you a friend to everybody in the organization, or are you a threat or a foe to some of the people in the organization that you're supporting? Are you a master or a slave to your customer? Are you a mentor to your customer, or are you using your customer to basically self-train yourself, be a pupil? Are you a specialist, or are you a hacker? These are some of the ways that your customers will view you and some of the ways that you need to present yourself with your customers. Most of us in the consulting arena are expected to do the job of what's called a thaumaturge. And for you linguistics in the group, the thaumaturge is a performer of magic feats. And this is something that a lot of our customers unrealistically expect us to do. Picture some sort of modern-day magician who can pull a proverbial rabbit out of a hat, or a first responder who's pulling someone out of an emergency situation or a fire, a medic putting someone back together at the front line, someone at a restaurant performing the Heimlich maneuver. These are some of the high and lofty expectations that are placed on consultants. And these expectations may not be realistic always. There are lots of reasons for customers to be happy with your services. The biggest reason is that you solve their problem or their problems faster, better, or cheaper than if they did the work themselves or hired another consultant who was less efficient and less effective than you are. So what does a happy customer really look like? Well, it depends on who your customer is and what they want, and if or whether you met their expectations. So we briefly talked about some of the challenges just to set the stage for this talk. And these are things that your customers face, and they're key to making them happy. It all comes down to, what do you want from the customer relationship? What do your customers want? What's realistic to expect? And is there sufficient overlap between what you want and they want? Now we're going to look at 3 dimensions of customer happiness. What do you do before they become your customer? What do you do while you're engaged with them? And what do you do once the engagement is over? So let's start with before. And at this point, I'm going to ask people to think about any questions that you have about challenges and just jot them down. So at the end, we don't get inundated with a bunch of last-minute questions. So if you have any questions about the challenges, this is a good time to jot them down. Companies often wait until they reach some sort of crisis mode before they seek outside assistance. A typical call for emergency support requires sometimes immediate attention from consultants. I don't know about you, but this is the case in my profession, which is largely related to proposal support. And I need to provide either myself or one of our consultants on site very often within a 24-hour period, or else the proposal is in serious jeopardy. This unplanned situation requires a consultant who is very well versed at damage control, an expert who can operate like the head surgeon of a MASH unit, someone who puts in long nights and weekends to, quote unquote, rescue your patient. Well, how can you make customers happy in this case? Before you start, you must be prepared to step into a crisis quickly, be able to assess the damage, be able to deliver immediate results without any of the time-consuming distractions and politics that are often faced by the rest of the team. In times of need, many organizations secure resources from their internal operational units within the company. These resources are often billable subject matter experts who are either currently supporting valuable customers or temporarily on the professional services bench. Companies have to beg, borrow, and sometimes outright steal these resources to help. It's important to remember that most accomplished subject matter experts who are pressed into duty likely represent some of the best employees on the company payroll. The real cost of making these superstars employees non-billable for some period of time to do your project, combined with a lost opportunity cost of taking them away from their customers, makes it difficult for the people who are bringing you into an organization. So why is it important? Why is it important to know if your customers are begging, borrowing, or stealing subject matter experts in the past to do the work that you are now being asked to do? Well, if they decide to secure external help from you, you need to recognize the situation that you're being put in. You may be the hero to some of the subject matter experts who no longer have to do two jobs, their day job and the one that you've been hired to do. Or on the other hand, you may be a threat to their job if they're not pulling their weight and you're running circles around them in your consulting role. A big part of making customers happy is about charging the right amount of money. There's lots of theories about how to price your consulting services, and pricing has a lot to do with customer happiness in some cases. Are you a value-based pricer? Is your compensation based on a retainer? Do you have a fixed fee, or do you use good old-fashioned time and materials? A lot of time, this decision and the pricing mechanism depends on the industry standard for the industry that you're in and what your customers expect. But picking the right pricing mechanism is important. Good consultants can be very expensive, especially in the high demand areas such as Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based. Some consulting rates may seem high on the surface, but it's your job to help customers understand that they may pale in comparison to some of the rates and some of the pricing of other professions. Customers typically have pricing expectations. There's no way around that. One way to make them happy before you start work is to make them feel that they have some control over costs. But how do you do that? Many of your customers may be completely new to the consulting area. I see this with typically small companies who have not had the opportunity to hire consultants before. They have no idea how to find a good or best consultant for the job. Some even search the internet and do general Google searches to find consultants in a city or in an industry. Obviously not the way to do it, but when somebody calls me and tells me that that's how they do it, I'm not going to be one to argue. But helping customers be happy before they pick you is all about educating them about the market. What are other companies, your competitors, doing? Who are the real players in the industry? What are their rates? What's your true value proposition compared to some of the other companies that your customer can pick? Help them feel that they've made an informed decision to contact you or pick you. Explore the possibilities. Think about giving your customer options. Share some stories. Talk about pay me now or pay me later, as the old Fram oil filter commercial talked about. Talk about the importance of efficiency as opposed to rate. Talk about bringing value as opposed to charging an hourly rate. But help your customers understand before they pick you that listening to you and picking you is the right idea. Start a consultative selling approach before they even pick you. Customers often face an uphill battle to justify spending the money that they need to get external help. Before a customer picks you, help make them happy by developing a business case or providing support and advice to help them justify the services to themselves and to their management. How can you do this? Figure out what the cost or hours it would take for your customer to do the work. Figure out how much it would take for you to do the work. The delta between those two is really the return on investment that you provide to your customer. If it's a strategic engagement, then in some cases your work is directly related to the survival of the company. In that case, the rate becomes, to a point, immaterial because what you're doing is priceless for the company. Help the decision maker who's picking you be happy about how they pick you and why they pick you by providing enough information for them to build a compelling business case in their mind and a business case for their boss so that you come in with appropriate expectations. But no matter what you do before you get hired, one of the most important and valuable things I've learned is to get a job description of what you're supposed to do in writing. Get those expectations in writing, whether it be in a contract, a consulting agreement, a task order, a job description as is depicted here, although this isn't the format for a job description I would pick, but it's a generic one. But the more detail that you have that's documented, the better understanding that you and the company that you're going to be working with have about the mutual goals and objectives of the engagement and your ability to meet or exceed expectations. Take the time to think about and write down a description of the work that you're going to do. What are the services that you're going to provide? What are the capabilities and experience that you have that your customer wants? Make sure you're right size qualified, not underqualified or overqualified. And with our company, we use a simple opportunity description that includes the following topics at a minimum: role, responsibility, skills and experience, when the work is going to be done and where the work is going to be done, how long is the engagement, how much will it cost, what are the target number of hours per week or per day or per engagement, what kind of management style works best with your company, and we'll talk about management style a little bit more. What deliverables are required, what equipment is required, what target hours and total budget is required. The more that you document this before you start, the happier your customer is going to be once you show up to do the work, because it'll be a lot more clear about what they expect and what you can deliver. So that wraps up some of the things that we can do before an engagement starts. And this would be a good time to jot down any questions that you have about what we just talked about. Things like, well, my customer is not in an emergency situation, or my customer doesn't beg, borrow, or steal, or cost is not an issue, or why should I help customers shop around if I want them to pick me, or how can I do a business case if it's too detailed in a pro bono activity that I can't afford to support. Those kinds of questions might be appropriate, or any other questions that you have. So let's shift now from what you can do before an engagement to make a customer happy to what you can do during an engagement. And these are the things that most people probably focus on and think about. Let's say you've been an active participant in helping to make your prospective customer happy, and they picked you. Now they're no longer a prospect, but they're your newest customer. What do you do now to live up to the expectations that you've set for them? Well, expectation setting is important in business and in your personal life as well. Is your customer expecting a long-term relationship like a marriage, or are they expecting a date or a one-night stand or something in between? It's really important in terms of what you expect and what your customers expect in terms of how you frame the arrangement, the kind of work that you do, whether you decide to go above and beyond what the customer expects. It's one of the biggest stumbling blocks to hire a consultant for a long-term and expensive engagement is that they don't really know what they're paying for. So will you be a glorified note taker, or will you be a proactive strategic force? Will your project achieve the goals that have been set forth? Will the customer be stuck if you don't work out? Well, if either you or your customer are not sure, one way to make them happy is to agree to some sort of a trial period before you commit to a long-term engagement. This is one surefire way to make a customer happy who's a little bit anxious about a long-term engagement. The trial period depends on the customer, the work that you're doing, and what you're willing to accept. It can be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could even be longer, depending upon the scope of work. But considering a trial period can help make your customers happy. Another way to make customers happy is to define your work or your deliverables or your milestones into small chunks. Start with a small project or a small milestone or a small deliverable as a proof of concept to show the customer what you can do, to show them the value of what you can bring, to demonstrate how long it takes for you to provide that value. Then build on that small chunk with a slightly bigger chunk and a bigger chunk after that. And if you quote unquote chunk your projects into pieces, then it's easier for you to manage, it's easier for you to control, it's easier for your customer to also manage, oversee, and control you, and it also helps with their budgetary process. You can make customers happy if you help them buy in small chunks. Knowing your place in a customer's stable, if you will, is another way to make them happy during an engagement. Do they need a racehorse? Are you a racehorse for them? Do they need a workhorse? Do they need a stud? Who do they need? You need to help your customers build a stable of consultants, or are they just looking for a one-time consultant and that's you? Will they value introductions that you can make to them, to trade associations, networking groups, other consultants with similar or complementary skills and experience? Do they value best practices in the industry that you could send to them, or new industry developments? Help them define your role and whether you are providing them, what you're providing them with, does it go beyond what's in your consulting agreement? Will introductions to people or best practices be of value? And how comfortable are you with referrals, either referring other people, referring documents, referring best practices? These are really important things for you to think about before or while you're engaged with a customer. Is you can make customers happier if you help them build a trusted stable of resources, and that's people, processes, technology, and best practices all together. But what about this idea of sharing best practices? Sharing best practices can be a surefire way to make your customers happy, right? I mean, isn't it one of the reasons why they hired you in the first place? However, there's a fine line between sharing best practices and violating non-disclosure and confidential or proprietary information. So sharing confidential and proprietary information from other customers in order to gain favor with your new customer is unethical, obviously, and will eventually come back to haunt you. So one surefire way to keep your customers happy is to strike a balance between what can and should be shared, what is in the public domain, what is shareable, and what is considered to be confidential or proprietary. And think about it. If you have a customer and you give them a document that you have that was clearly developed by you for another customer, what are the chances that they're thinking you might do the same for the next customer and share the valuable deliverables and information that you just developed for them, possibly at a high price, for the next customer? So every time you share something, think about how is that going to be viewed by my customer, and whether they project forward and think about how comfortable they would be if I shared that same type of information, their information, with the next customer. So keeping customers happy means knowing what to share, it means knowing when to share it, and it means knowing how to share it. And there can be a big difference even between verbal sharing and email sharing. And we won't get into that nuance here, but there's lots of different ways to share information, and you have to be extraordinarily careful about how you share best practices with customers in order to keep them happy. Customers are often confused over whether they need a single consultant, a generalist, or multiple consultants, all wrapped up into one, or a specialist to meet their requirements. Keeping customers happy means knowing when they need generalized help, knowing when they need specialized help, or both, and knowing what your capabilities are and what the expectations are for you. If a company is hiring you as a specialist and asking you to do a specific role, and you find yourself being more comfortable to do other adjunct roles related to that, then you won't be successful. If they're asking you to do multiple roles of a generalist, but you only tend to focus on the one thing that you know the best, more of a specialized approach, then you won't be successful, and the customers won't be happy either. If you don't have the customer knowledge you think you need to be successful, or you don't understand what your role is supposed to be, generalist or specialist, then talk to your customer about it, or consider recommending an additional consultant to fill the gaps. No one really wants consultants from out of town, especially if there's an ample supply of qualified and available resources in their backyard. This is particularly true in the Washington, D.C. area in a number of industries, especially the proposal industry, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of consultants. The additional expense of being out of town, the inherent inefficiencies of travel, for many customers are simply not worth it. So if you're based in D.C., for example, there's no reason for your customers to look elsewhere for full-time or on-site consultants. However, there may be a case where they might, especially if they're not in D.C., in a remote location where there's limited commercial or government commerce nearby, or if they are in a consulting boom town like Washington, D.C., sometimes remote help is a lot less expensive if they're looking for bargain basement deals. So keeping customers happy means knowing where they want you to be and when they want you to be there and how comfortable they are for you to providing services from out of town. Some are going to be delighted that you're from out of town because the work may be remote and your rate may be a lot less inexpensive. Some may be skeptical if you're from out of town because they couldn't find any local resources, or they have to pay extra, or they feel like they made the wrong decision. It's also important, if you are from out of town, to make sure it's clear what's reimbursable in terms of expenses and what isn't. And is travel time billable? And if so, how much? And making sure all of those things are clearly articulated and discussed either before, or in some cases it doesn't happen until you're actually engaged, will help keep customers happy about whether you're local or out of town and functioning efficiently and effectively. In this day of instant gratification and what I'm calling nanosecond response times, I'm amazed to find consultants and consulting companies who still work out of the old brick and mortar paradigm with receptionists and limited operating hours. I heard about a consultant who had a bad day once and left their job site at 6 o'clock in the evening and didn't respond to customer voicemail or email until almost noon the next day. When she finally checked in, she was surprised that she was released from the project. But some of your customers require and expect immediate turnaround. And if you don't provide that turnaround and you don't understand what that ethic is for turnaround, you're not going to keep your customers happy. The consulting industry, in my opinion, is too competitive in general and too fast-paced to successfully operate in a 9-to-5 mode. Many customers want consultants who respond quickly to their needs and deliver same-day or just-in-time results, day or night. But either way, in order to keep your customers happy during an engagement, it's important to set this expectation and live up to the expectation. And if you've set the expectation that you're around-the-clock, 24-hour service, available anytime, day or night, and weekends, which is a way that I position my services, and you don't live up to it, then that's a problem. So make sure that you can make a promise and keep your promise in terms of the kind of service ethic that you can deliver. The personality of a consultant and the fit with the corporate culture of your customer is often overlooked. A lot of times in my industry it comes down to resumes and rates, and that's what customers want to focus on. But I continually try to tell them that they need to look at the cultural fit of this person and if or whether they'd fit into an organization. And if it feels like it's a square peg going into a round hole, like you see in this picture, then that's not going to work. In an industry filled with full-time employees who are often overworked and underpaid, even consultants with a reputation for open communication or diplomacy, expertise, congeniality may be considered unwelcome outsiders if there's no good cultural fit. And high pay and superior skills and experience are only a few of the what I'm calling no fault of your own factors that can come between the success of an external hire and a flop. So even if customers view you as a high-paid consultant with superior skills and experience, but you don't fit in for whatever reason, then you will not be successful and customers will not be happy. So how do you make sure that you're a good cultural fit for your customer? Well, dictator or diplomat is the way that I look at it, and the personality and leadership style of a consultant can sometimes make the difference. Think of here George Patton, for those of you who don't know him, referred to in World War II as old blood and guts. He was a 4-star general, very eccentric, controversial, outspoken, take charge kind of guy. Some consultants need a George Patton. Other consultants need a more diplomatic role of somebody like George Mitchell, senator, special envoy, someone who's a lot more gray area, someone who's not as controversial, someone who's not soft-spoken. So the same consultant can be success in one company and a failure in another. Some companies need George Patton and you are George Mitchell, or you propose George Mitchell, then that's not going to work, even if it's essentially the same role. So it's almost as important to think about the character, the leadership, and your management style than it is about what's on your resume. And you need to have this discussion with your customer. And as you are walking the halls and as you are doing the good consulting work that you do, you need to assess, do they need a George Patton, do they need a George Mitchell, or do they need somebody in between? And that's a really important distinction to make. I had a guy I'll call Andy who was really rated average as a remote writer, but I had him do an on-site task order management role, and he was rated exceptional. It's the same guy. He had the same experience, but he was rated totally different. A lot of it had to do with whether the role fit and the kind of personality he had. I had another consultant, Robin, who was very capable, very experienced, and looked great on paper, but at some point the customer thought she was arrogant and inflexible. And so I suggested that we replace her right away, and we did. But that's something that may or may not come out in an interview for those of you who have to interview for your work, and not. Another consultant, Bob, customer said he talks too much and doesn't listen enough. So those are sort of things that you need to be cognizant of in terms of your customer expectations, and those are keys to making them happy. An important factor in keeping customers happy is whether you are conforming or non-conforming. On the left here, the court jesters of medieval times were appointed by kings to keep them happy. They were the ultimate yes men or yes people, conforming to what the king wanted to hear, not what the king needed to hear. Consultants should be conforming to a point, but kowtowing to management is usually not the path to success. Sometimes making customers happy means you shouldn't be afraid to tell them where they fall short and to suggest on ways to improve. Granted, this can be a very difficult and challenging situation, and maybe you have some specific experiences or examples that we could talk about in terms of, or in the Q&A period, to be able to figure out, should you be conforming or you should be an out-of-the-box innovative thinker, or do you need to be something in between? But I think generally the key is striking a balance between knowing when to make recommendations, especially if they're controversial ones, what you should recommend, and how you should recommend them. Customers are often teams of people, not just the single individual that may have hired you. And your success and customer happiness depends largely on the expectations not of one person, but of an entire team that you work with, in addition to the people who are, or person who's paying for your services. Take the time to meet and greet and get to know your stakeholders in a customer engagement. What are their aspirations? What are their personal goals, their professional goals? What are their hot buttons? Check in with them frequently and get team member feedback across the team. If people think that you are being efficient, are you using your time well and turning in deliverables on a timely manner? Are you being effective? Are those deliverables high quality and meeting the goals and objectives of your customer and the engagement? Is there a good personality fit? Do you have to be a George Mitchell for one person and a George Patton for others within the organization? How are you fitting in culturally and personally? How is your management style? Are there things that we should be, do you need to bug people more, or are you bugging people too much? Are you being too aggressive or not aggressive enough? And checking in frequently with the team and asking them for feedback in these and other areas is a surefire way to keep customers happy. Well, despite all these great suggestions that I'm hoping you're hearing, as I can't hear you, despite all these great suggestions, it's not easy to keep customers happy. Some people have said it takes teamwork and determination and patience to the same as climbing the Matterhorn. And others have said, well, it takes the planning and budget and technology to put a man on the moon. And others have said it takes the perseverance and patience to find a needle in a haystack. And if you put all of those things together, then maybe, just maybe, you can keep your customers happy. Well, in a study conducted by the Association of Proposal Management Professionals a few years ago, there were some interesting statistics that I want to share with you. 13% of consultants were prematurely released from engagements. So clearly, at least 13% of the companies, of the consultants, did not do the work as companies expected, and the companies were not happy. A more dramatic metric is that 43% of the companies reported at one point or another prematurely releasing a consultant. So that means one of every two companies that you work with or will work for in the future have released a consultant because they weren't happy with the services. Now, we're not talking about whether a project was canceled, and I'm sure that has an impact here, but I'm trying to make a dramatic point that it's not easy to keep consultants, and because you're a consultant, a lot of companies feel that they can be justified to let you go before the work is done, and that's typically written in a consulting agreement. What I found fascinating is that 19% of companies actually retain poor performers, performers that they're not happy with. And this is striking to me because as someone who runs an organization, I am continually asking my customers, is Susie working out or is Johnny working out? And what can we do better? And often I hear everything's fine, everything's fine. Sometimes after I take a customer satisfaction survey, I'll find that there may be a person who had a challenge or a problem with something that their consultant did. Certainly nothing that would require releasing a consultant, but certainly something that could have been communicated sooner and addressed sooner so that the customer ends up being happier. So part of this is about what we've talked about earlier, is looking for ways to keep your customer happy along the way in terms of expectation setting, but continuously checking in with your customer or customers to make sure that they're not just keeping you around because it's too hard to find somebody else. Then in the end, they'll never ask you back. And we'll talk about the importance of being asked back as a repeat customer. So that concludes the during component. We talked about the challenges, talked about what you can do before, and we talked about what you can do during an engagement to keep a customer happy. This might be a good time to think about, if you have a question, to jot it down about some ideas or experiences that you had or some difficulties that you had with maybe some of the suggestions that I'm making. Let's wrap up quickly with what you can do after an engagement. Because many consultants think that keeping customers happy is only or most important during an engagement. For those focused on short-term goals or maximizing revenue or an immediate return on investment, the idea of some sort of value-added follow-up is kind of a foreign concept to a lot of people. A lot of us consistently forget about old customers and quickly move onto new and exciting and fresh new prospects. But it's important to remember that your old customers are sometimes the ones who are most likely to be your next customer, or even better, most likely to provide a referral to your next customer. And that's much more valuable to you as a consultant than pursuing what I call cold prospects, or what the industry calls cold prospects, who might be in your current pipeline. You want warm prospects that are existing customers or referrals from existing customers. And how do you do that? Because once you deliver good work and you're out of sight, the longer you're out of sight and out of mind, the more likely they may be to forget about you or pick somebody else. Or if they're in a rush and they call two people and somebody else gets back to them first, then you're kind of out of luck. So what can you do to continue to provide value after an engagement is over to keep your customers happy? I've got a couple of suggestions here. You don't want to put all of your faith and all of your money into a single consultant, no matter how great that consultant is. And I happen to think that I'm a pretty good consultant. I've been at it for a number of years, and I have 160 customers, and a lot of them are repeat customers. However, consultants like me and most people have other assignments from time to time, are on vacation, get sick, relocate, or change jobs. And so you want to share information with your customer after you're done to make sure that you're well positioned to continue to do work, or if you're not, to help them find somebody that you can recommend. And those valued referrals have a lot to do with the value that you provide to a customer and your long-term success and long-term happiness with the customer. It's something that I find a lot of consultants don't do. They don't send emails and check in on customers. They don't forward best practices. They don't engage them in LinkedIn blog discussions. They don't invite them to important industry events. They don't tip them onto the newest or latest technology that may affect what they're doing. That kind of information sharing, informal, in a consultative approach, is really an important thing to do. You can do it with a phone call, you can do it with an email address, an email message, or something else. Another thing that consultants don't do after the engagement is have customers complete an evaluation of services. And this is something that I do almost every time, especially if it's a new engagement with a new company or a new consultant. If they're a new consultant to that organization, or if it's a new organization. Getting objective feedback from a number of people who have observed the value proposition and actually the value that you provide, and whether that lives up to your value proposition, is really important, so that you can understand what your strengths were, how they were viewed across the organization, what areas you can improve on. You want some sort of objective numeric score across some number of activities, and I have, I think, 8 or 10 that are on the form that I use. And then you want some sort of free-form part of the simple one-page evaluation that talks about, what things did I do well, or how can I improve, or what kinds of future opportunities do you see for me in your company or with other companies that you work with. So this idea of an evaluation is something that I don't see a lot of at all in my industry. It's something that I consider a differentiator for my company. And so sharing that idea with you is kind of like sharing a trade secret, but I figure I've got a head start because I've been doing them for the past 13 years. The last thing is about sharing lessons learned with the company based on the project, that you just completed. And I typically will capture lessons learned throughout a project. I'll keep track of them in terms of what are the external forces that come to play here that are really out of everybody's control. But more important, what are the strengths and challenges or improvement areas of the people who are assigned to do the work, of the processes and templates that we use to do the work, or the technology and tools that we use to do the work. And after my engagement is over, I'll typically share these lessons learned with my customer. And that will also give me some clues if they don't fill out the service evaluation. And sometimes customers are very reluctant to do that. They just don't take the time, and too much time goes by. They get caught up in the next thing, and you don't want to hound them more than maybe once or twice to say, hey, please fill this in and I'll share the results. I'll compile the results and share them with your team. Some companies don't take advantage of that, but they will take advantage of having a dialogue in terms of some of the lessons that you might have learned that they can apply to future projects that relate to the project you just did, or to future consultants that they might hire. Okay, wrapping it up. I would say that expectation setting, communications, cultural fit, writing things down, following up after a job is all important. But there's a secret that I would say pales in comparison to what customers really care about the most. Why did they pick you in the first place, and why are they likely to ask you back for more help? And that secret has to do with this idea of trust. And I don't know if anybody on this call has ever heard of the Trust Quotient. Here's the website for the Trust Quotient, and I'll describe in a minute as we close what the Trust Quotient is. But I found this a fascinating exercise that, you know, making customers happy and keeping them happy comes down to who they like, who they want to work with, and who they trust. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that points to this idea of trust. And the trusted advisor put together this Trust Quotient, which has three variables in the numerator. One is credibility, which means how much of an authority are you in the area that they're asking you to help them with? How much experience and what are your qualifications in the particular area of expertise that they need do you have? That's credibility. Reliability is when you make promises, do you keep them? If I'm going to give you a report tomorrow by COB, do I always do it? Do I show up for meetings on time? Or do I show up for meetings early? Or do I give you deliverables early? Even more reliability. Or am I perpetually late, perpetually making promises that I can't keep? Unreliable. The third value in the numerator is about customer intimacy, and that is, do customers tell you things that they don't tell even their own employees or other consultants? And this is typically an area that most consultants need help with. In fact, stereotypically, most men need more help with this area than women do. Women tend to have more intimate and meaningful relationship conversations, even if it's related to work, than men do. Men are somewhat more reluctant to do that. So for those of you who are men in the audience and consultants, this is an area that you want to work on. Now, all of that's nice, but what undermines it is what's in the denominator, which is this idea of self-orientation. And if you're dealing with customers and it's all about you or your company or your service or how great you are or how great your deliverable is, and it's not about the customer, the benefits that you provided to the customer, how you help them, and the focus on them and not you, it will dramatically reduce your trust quotient. So one of the things you might take away from this webinar is to go onto this website, it's a free questionnaire. I think there's 20 questions. You got 5 choices. I almost always do it. I sometimes do it. I never do it. You'll get a score, a composite score out of 15. The average, by the way, is 6.5, and you'll get a little report that says what your areas of improvement are and what you can do to build trust. But no matter what I say about keeping customers happy, if they don't like you and they don't trust you, then none of this will be of any value to you. So in closing, the next steps are really up to you. The webinar that we just completed will be a complete waste of your time and my time if you don't take some sort of action to better position you and your customer to be more happy. Think about things that you can do today. What can you start with now? What first steps can you take to begin to think about how to make and keep your customers happy? And then once you get them, practice them and then follow up. Things that you might consider are getting a copy of these materials or reviewing your notes or taking the Trust Quotient assessment or developing a job description template if you don't have one or developing a customer service evaluation if you don't have one or a lessons learned template or about thinking about different pricing strategies that might make your customer happier, or how you might chunk your services, or what your referral approach is. Those are all specific areas, suggestions, steps that you can take right now, today, after this webinar, to make your customers happy. Think about what's most important to your business. Is it making money and short-term return on investment, or is it building relationships and delivering value? Once you decide what's right for you and for your customers, making and keeping them happy is a lot easier. Thank you very much. Here is my contact information. Feel free to contact me anytime or send me a LinkedIn invitation. And now with the 8 minutes remaining, I'm going to turn it over to Emily for Q&A.
Chris, thank you so much for the great material presented on this webinar. We've had quite a few questions come in from the audience, so I'm going to hit a couple of high points here. We had a few questions come in regarding the service evaluation form. So, Chris, we're wondering if there's maybe an example form that you could provide or at least some tips for the audience?
Well, as you might expect, I'm kind of reluctant to provide my own evaluation form. I bet if you did Google searches, you could easily find them. It's not terribly hard to develop one. It probably takes a half an hour of time. I think what you need to think about are what are the 5 or 8 or 10 things that are important for customers to evaluate you on. Is it your do you follow deadlines? Are you a good communicator? Are your writing skills important? Are your presentation skills important? Are you a team player? Whatever those things are that you think your customers value. And I change evaluations by customer. I customize my own evaluations depending on the engagement. Some training ones are different from some proposal management ones. Some orals consulting ones are different from both of them. So, have some way of listing the 5 or 8 things. Use a simple scoring mechanism, 1 unsatisfactory, 5 outstanding, and 3 in the middle. Have them score it, and then have a couple questions about what are the major strengths and what are major weaknesses. I mean, it's really not rocket science. It's not hard. The hard part is really having the discipline to send it to your customers and to get customers to complete it.
Thank you, Chris. Another question we received related to best practices and confidentiality. Let's say I developed a seminar with a number of case studies based on my previous experiences with clients. So I'm not showing any specific numbers or values, specific names, point locations, etc., and not providing a copy of my PowerPoint files and not providing a hard copy of my presentation. Do you have any comments regarding this approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for sharing as much as you reasonably can, within the letter of agreements that you have with your customers. So you have to be careful about a lot of consulting agreements that have specific language about if or whether something is, a proprietary deliverable and who has the ownership rights to that deliverable. But if you're not sharing anything, if the concept was yours and it's a concept, let's say that you you've used before to develop seminars, then that's already in the public domain. That's not proprietary. And as long as you refrain from using, the customer name without their permission, some customers will allow the permission, some won't, and certainly stay away from the metrics as the person asking the question suggests, then I think you should generally be fine with that.
Great, thank you for those comments. Moving onward, something else related to the subject. If you are writing an article or blog, should you get explicit written consent to share your synthesized lessons learned about several projects?
Well, as long as you don't, what's amazing to me is that the lessons learned from project to project tend to be the same. Most things that customers do wrong, a lot of them do wrong. And so there's no great proprietary secret to some lesson that that you learned or that a company learned. And as long as you're not saying, when I was working for Lockheed or when I was working for Northrop or Booz Allen or this agency or this nonprofit, that here's the lessons. As long as you don't attribute it to that entity, that customer entity, then you should be fine in any article or any blog. I do that all the time, but I use generalized examples. If you're looking for a more focused article or more focused blog, then sometimes customers, if it's a happy ending and it's something that one of your customers is proud of, sometimes customers would actually be very willing to share the information that it was them. And so in those cases, they got free publicity. Potentially, they're viewed as a market leader, and you're viewed as someone who helped them achieve that market leadership in whatever project you happen to be working on.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for one more question, so I'll go with one that I hear quite a bit from the consultants that we work with. Should we be charging a flat rate per day, even if we're working until 10 p.m.?
That is a great question. Part of it depends on what is the industry norm, and part of it depends on what the customer expectation is. I don't like the idea of a flat rate. Flat rates work really well for consultants who are not in the top 5% performers, because if you're in a top 5% performer, 9 times out of 10, your customer is going to ask you to do a lot more work than either one of you ever agreed to do in the first place. And so you need to decide how tightly you want to manage that scope. I tend to plan on a 10-hour day, and I tend to manage to a 10-hour day, and I'll set a fixed price planning ceiling on a fixed price rate per day based on 10 hours. And 9 times out of 10 over the life of a project, amazingly enough, it's right around 10 hours. So it ends up coming out the same amount. But it's hard for me to personally justify charging $1,000 a day and a day that I work 3 hours one day, and $1,000 a day on a day that I work 14 hours. To me, it just doesn't make sense. If a customer is looking to spread their payments out, then that's another issue, and you can figure out a payment plan that's separate from your billable work. But at least for my profession, which is capture, business development, capture, proposal, development, delivery, training, best practices, I don't see a lot of fixed rate per day, and I don't see a lot of customers that expect that.
Great, Chris. Thank you again for that feedback. That's fantastic. So, folks, we're going to throw up a quick poll here on the screen. So if you could take a look at that and answer appropriately, we would appreciate it.
And Emily, any feedback that any of the people attending, maybe upwards of a couple hundred people on this webinar, if any of them have any feedback for me, feel free to send me an email, call, or provide comments through this poll if appropriate. I don't see the poll, but to MBO, and hopefully that'll help me improve for the next time.
Certainly, Chris. We'll get those right over to you. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We appreciate your time and attention. And please reach out to us should you ever have any questions, or reach out to Chris appropriately. Thank you so much.